Meant as a quid pro quo of introductions. That's a total misuse of what I just did there. That's not what a quid pro quo is. If I say hey, good afternoon and expect you to say good afternoon in return, you don't have to do that. It would be awkward if you all as a class just repeated in almost monotone-like, follower-like fashion. Good afternoon. That's what we have to do with little kids. Little kids do that. Good afternoon, Mrs. blah, 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 or Mrs. blah. Okay, so enough of that. I want to wrap up our discussion of the Paul Bloom reading from last time, then get into the Clifford reading. By way of, we'll start with a brief discussion, you're in small groups discussion of your questions, and I'll discuss that and what is expected of you with respect to those. Again, I'll remind you about that. For today, you had the first discussion questions due before class. That's to get you to do the reading, and it's get you to have something to think about and to talk about in class. So, last time, we were looking at Paul Bloom. We're looking at evolutionary, psychological, scientific explanations for why it is, how it is that something like the supernatural, belief in the supernatural, is still with us. It's 2020. We landed a man on the moon, after all. Why is there still religious belief? You can kind of sense that's Paul Bloom in the background. How can there still be religious belief when science has progressed so far and answered so many of these otherwise or hitherto erstwhile theological questions? I don't ever say erstwhile or hitherto. I'm not sure I used those correctly just now, but I'm just doing it in a mocking tone. I apologize if you like either one of those words. Prior to the development of evolutionary theory, we'll talk about Darwin a little bit, there weren't a whole lot of options for explanations. We looked a little bit at Marx's explanations, and we looked a little bit at Marx's view as the religion is a kind of opiate, it's a kind of drug, it's a crutch, it's to help us deal with the horrors of being a sentient being capable of suffering and feeling pain in this wretched existence. But if we don't already have the beliefs in the supernatural, then the success of such belief systems as an opiate wouldn't make much sense. How can I sort of glom onto the religion as opiate hypothesis if I don't already accept that I'm going to be soothed in some way by having religious beliefs or belief in the afterlife? Then we looked briefly at religion as a kind of fraternity, as a kind of group cohesion. And by the way, there's significant data, he doesn't address this, significant data that the kind of group cohesion that religions bring for people, the kind of stability that it gives to families, just a simple weekly routine of seeing other people, even if you're not a religious person, there's something to the aspect of one's fulfilling life. What is fulfilling in one's life? Friendship is a key thing. And one way of maintaining friendships is this kind of fraternal cohesiveness we're found with respect to religious groups and religious identity and going to church. One of the concerns in the face of what's known as the new atheist movement, which we saw, and we'll talk about Richard Dawkins a little bit more, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, they're called the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism. I don't know if it's not as popular as it once was back, like, say, 10 years ago. But the concern that many have is that Dawkins, for instance, comes in and just undermines religious faith and shows it is absolutely irrational and foolish. We need to get rid of it. He sees it as a danger. Christopher Hitchens said something similar. And there's a concern that if enough people see that, then we remove that kind of group cohesion, that group identity, that social practice of simply meeting once a week. It sounds like a simple thing, but it's quite a big thing. And you have nothing to replace it. That can have some long-lasting negative effects. However, this fraternal notion is not sufficient. Why was it not a sufficient explanation for religious ideas and belief in the supernatural, for why it continues, why beliefs such as the supernatural continue?
It doesn't explain like the religious aspect of it.
Right. We could be, because there are actual fraternities that aren't religious.
It's not a unique characteristic.
It doesn't give us the necessary or sufficient conditions by any means, and it leaves out too many other things that are clearly fraternal, group-based, but have no explanation. They offer nothing for why it is we have religious ideas such as spirits, creator God, divine entity, petitionary prayers to such beings, and so forth. So what Bloom considers then is the idea that it's not social. Religion is not social. It's not something that's entirely learned. There are elements of it, of course, that are learned. It's not surprising that if somebody is born a Catholic in a Catholic family, they're going to learn the tenets of Catholicism and the practices and rituals. And the rituals of such. Same thing whether it's a Protestant, whether it's Hindu, Confucian, and so forth. But it's the underlying theological belief systems that seem to be hardwired, that seem to be present, regardless of culture. 2 points. We are naturally born dualists, and we're naturally born creationists. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but first on the dualist aspect. What's a dualist? Anyone remember from intro?
If you took means that the mind and body are separate.
Precisely. That the mind and body are separate, that the mind can continue on after the death of the body. In fact, most Americans, still today, are what we would call Cartesian substance dualists. We are comprised of a physical substance, and we are comprised of a mind. And we just are, in different ways of cashing this out. We just are minds, and our bodies are vehicles that transport us. And the body is not us. It's important to us, just like our cars are important to us. But for instance, if I wrecked my car, if I totaled my Porsche tomorrow, I'm not going to be upset. Well, I will be. I mean, luckily I have 2 Porsches, so I'm all right. But if I total one of my Porsches, it's not Porsche, right? That's going to be upsetting to me. But it's not the end of the world, as people say, right? Because that's just a vehicle to transport me. We might say the same thing about our bodies. At least that's what we find within dualist traditions. Now, creationist idea, that's the idea that there is intentionality. We see it in the physical universe. It came about with reason, with justification, with purpose. We see purpose, we see intent. There's a reason for the things that we see. And this, Bloom argues, is not learned. We can see it within children. We can see how children respond to basic questions. And they gave an example of the alligator eating a little mouse. And then they asked the children, like really young kids, okay, kids, so Mousie's dead. I mean, that's what they tell them. What? And then they ask questions about the mouse. They ask him, I think I have an image of it. Looks like brown mouse got eaten by Mr. Alligator. As if it's not as horrible of a scenario by saying Mr. Alligator. It's a horrible scenario. This is life. Animals get eaten by other animals. Here, for instance, there's a little brown, I don't know if this is real. Kind of looks real. And the kids probably don't get this image. But then they're asked questions. Will Mouse need to go to the bathroom now? No, because he's dead. He's dead. But Mouse will have other thoughts. Notice the death of the mouse's body doesn't mean the thing is gone. Children have a natural inclination, as if it's hardwired, pre-wired, whatever term we want to use, to presume that what is the living thing, the thing that is you, that you identify with, is not your body. And they answer these questions in this way across cultures. And so again, it doesn't seem to be culture. It seems to be part of our biological, neurological structure. And you see it too with kids, but also adults, when they look at just objects with respect to intentionality. Did anyone watch this video?
Yes.
I guess it's 2 minutes, I think, so we can watch it. There's no sound to it. It's just tell us a story. What's happening? There's a triangle. There's another triangle. Doesn't it look like there's things happening for a reason? That the big triangle is kind of an ass, and then the circle's trying to skid away. Yeah, the big triangle's a total jackass. And then the little one's like, oh, what are you doing? I mean, you guys can make up your own stories. I'm not gonna explain this. But this is from 1944. The assumption is, and in each case, the subjects are asked to tell a story, what's happening. And it's very easy. It's almost impossible not to attribute some kind of intentionality to these figures. Now there's trouble. What's going to happen here? It's kind of funny. Good. That was a good move there, wasn't it? They teamed up. They did that on purpose. This shows purpose. Now, this may be a bad example, or maybe it's a good example because it's how creatures interact with other creatures. But they are minded creatures, if you will. Oh, there's more to it. Sorry, it's still going. It just destroys the whole house, does the first one. So there's the bully, then there's comradeship, and the story's almost always the same. Now, there's no obvious entities with intentionality there, but we read into it. We are primed, we are heightened. What is it? I can't remember the term that's used, but we have a kind of hyper priming to see intentionality and to see the difference between purely physical and that which is not physical yet still exists. Yes, and yes.
Oh, wasn't it
hypertrophic?
Yeah,
Hypertrophic, yeah, I think that's the word. And that was quoting from somebody. Hypersensitive to signs of agency. That's page 153.
Some anthropologists.
Yeah, where's the word they used, though? I'll use the term that I used last time. There's a book called Faces in the Clouds by Stuart Guthrie, and that's an example of finding signs of agency and patterns. You were mentioning patterns last time.
I mean, I have like an idea, obviously, but do you have a definition of supernatural?
So with Bloom's conception of it, a almost trivial term, a distinction between natural and the supernatural. The supernatural just would be over and above the natural. So if something is supernatural, don't imply Superman or something better or greater or amazing. It simply means beyond the natural, outside of the realm of science. It's typically how that's used. And it can be extremely broad, including, in some cases, a supernatural explanation for why this marker fell would be, my mind caused my brain to act, which caused my muscles to move, which caused me to open this up. If I'm a hardcore physicalist, I might say, oh, really, your mind, which is not physical, not part of this world, caused that to happen? That is a supernatural explanation, and it's unnecessary when we have a purely natural explanation for why it is that the marker fell, for example. So who you ask will vary, will change perhaps the sense and connotation of supernatural.
I was just going to ask, is it necessarily non-physical?
That's another good point, because some of it must be. So if we're looking at the mundane, this is the mundane existence, and here I'm just walking along. This is all physical explanation, and there's a train coming my way. Why am I trying to draw? Yeah, well, that's a house. No, that'll work. Anyway, there's a train, and it's heading toward me, and I'm not paying attention, and all of a sudden, like I'm just my headphones on, I'm walking like most people do, and probably I should get hit. So evolution, right? Survival of the fittest. We get rid of those people who can't pay attention while they're walking, and they're on their phones. I'm exaggerating that just a little bit. Anyway, the train's coming along, and then miraculously, the train stops inches before it hits me and kills me. So a supernatural explanation of that might be that God intervenes. God is not a physical being. God is transcendent, but causes something in the physical world, something naturally occurring, some boulder moving, whatever, and intervenes to divert it or something like that. So at some point there's still something above and beyond the natural explanations. And science wouldn't be able to say much about this unless we're Richard Dawkins and thinks, no, if you advocate for a God, science and religion, in fact, overlap, and we ought to be able to determine if there's a God intervening, the natural world should reveal that in such a way that we could determine whether or not the claims are true or false. I'll get to that in a moment. There's some distinctions. I don't know if that answers your question. It seems like at some point there's always something outside that's moving the natural world in a way that can't be explained in purely natural terms.
But does natural mean physical, or is there...
Not necessarily. Again, if we're dualists, my mind is part of nature, part of the world, in the sense that I'm having thoughts in time. Whether or not it's in space is a different question. but there's nothing supernatural for most dualists about minds. I think that's a very good question, and it's one of those things like religion that requires some conceptual analysis. The word natural is problematic in morals, as we'll see later on, because we might say whatever is natural is good in a moral sense. Whole Foods does this with their selling of their products. Whatever is natural must be good, and we sell all natural stuff, therefore it's all good. Well, what do you mean by natural? It doesn't have any synthetic products or whatever. It's not genetically modified and so forth, right? I mean, we
Lava
can
is
think.
good for your face.
What is it?
Lava is good for your face.
Yeah, lava is a naturally occurring substance. Although charcoal, that's not at all like lava. Lava is not good for your face or anything about you. So don't use lava on your face or anywhere. So it's naturally occurring. Hemlock or arsenic. I mean, there's a number of things that are natural, which we would not assume is good. And we have to figure out what qualifies as natural versus, let's say, synthetic. Computers are not natural in that they don't occur without human intervention, but they're still made of stuff from this world. They're not supernatural in any respects like that. All right, let me get back to Bloom to wrap up here.
What's that photo?
Oh, sorry. That. What is it? Good question. It's actually a green pepper.
Yeah.
Cut in such a way. I mean, if you look at it, those look like scary faces. Really, quite. If I cut that pepper open, I'm going to be a little bit. Even if I'm not prone toward, the existence of ghosts or the supernatural, back to our point, that's going to freak me out a little bit. Would it not you? If you cut that pepper,
Like
you
a
might even be
bad omen.
inclined to not eat that, just because it's a little bit weird. This one's not obvious to you. This one won't be obvious, but what is it you see there? It's an elephant. Elephants. Oh, it is obvious to you.
There's an ear on the ear and a nose.
There's an ear on the ear. There is. Ear upon ear. Why do we see that? Is there a face there? Are there faces there? What do we have here? Somebody a bit of a jackass here. The assumption is the Mother Mary, and it's an apparition type of thing found in an overpass. Quite a few of these are found in overpasses, where the water seems to form an image that looks like, you can kind of make it out if you look at it a certain way, images from the medieval period paintings of Mary, Mother of God, of Jesus. And then somebody added Satan loves just because people do that. Are they really there, or are these instances of pareidolia? Pareidolia, we talked about a little bit last time, has to do with seeing, in particular, faces in otherwise random bits of patterns. You see them at 9/11 here, of course, there's the devil. Those are just a couple of images taken very quickly, or stills, rather, of the smoke. With clouds, you tend to see faces. Why do you see faces? Do you remember? Why are we evolutionarily, here's the explanation, why are we evolutionarily primed to see faces, make out faces, even when there aren't any? Why is it to our benefit, evolutionarily speaking, to see faces?
It's like a defense mechanism. It's kind of like an instinct. If we were in the natural world or we were in a jungle, you want to think that you're seeing faces because you want to prepare for that face.
You would rather think there's a face and be mistaken, and there really isn't a face, than to think no face and there is a face, and that face eats you. Eaten by a face. You're evolutionarily better off getting it wrong, right, a false positive, than going the other direction. So we're primed, hardwired, to use Bloom's language, to see patterns, in particular faces, and intentionality, even where there might not be any. There's some pieces of toast I mentioned last time. Again, Mary, in this one sold for $250 on eBay, even with a bite out of it. $250. Question about the toast.
Yes.
Really? Okay.
Yes. What would it mean to say that those faces really are there? Like,
Well, that one really is there. I think somebody made a toaster with an imprint
like
to make toast with faces in it. So that one's really there, I
I
guess?
just don't know what the
What it
Like-
implies.
what the distinction is. Like clearly,
Good.
there's a we see a face, so we have the belief that there is a
Mhm.
face on the recognition is
Okay.
real, but what's the criteria determining what
The relevance of this pattern
Yeah.
being represented in such a way that human beings would recognize faces, whereas other species might say, well, nothing, they would just eat it. They would just eat it.
Is it not real if other
Good.
species can't see it?
Very good. I don't want to say it's not real. Do we have time for this? So you say there really are faces there.
I don't know.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, that was a knowing. Oh, it's going to be Britney Spears, of course. Well, for those of you who know about this, don't ruin it for others. I'm going to play Britney Spears music backwards, and there's going to be a message. Or is there? This goes back to the faces. Maybe it's not properly analogous. Some of you have seen this before. Again, don't ruin it. I'm going to turn it up to 11 because it's Britney Spears. Let's play it forward first. All right. You all familiar with Britney Spears' work? Obviously, great stuff. We're going to play it backwards. I want you to pay attention. Hear the message. All right, so it's.
Couldn't hear it.
Did anyone catch it? Or some of you may know this already. All right, don't ruin it. You want to hear it again? I mean, it's as clear as day for me. I can't help but hear it. Much to my. Everyone get it? Okay, hold on. Do that so we know it's a quote. Is it obvious now? All right, listen carefully. Oh, indeed. That's
Power of suggestion when you write it down.
yes, it is, and that's what this whole video is. Where is my thing? There's a whole thing on YouTube that's a guy did a whole show about this where it suggests by way of seeing the images, the words, and then you do hear it. It's quite fascinating. The question then is there something similar here? Is there a power of suggestion based on expectation and our minds being primed, our brains being primed to make out these patterns where there may not be any? There weren't any patterns until I primed you with respect to the oral representation. The visual is already there for us, I guess Bloom's response would be, which makes the visual illusion or the visual instance of pareidolia, what's this, a little bit different. Okay, where am I? Sorry. Did you want to add to it, though? You had a question.
No.
So what does it mean that God is an accident, then? Oh, go ahead.
Going back to the toast, what would it mean assuming that, yes, we see those images there, but we are assuming something supernatural with the toast to reflect?
So, yeah, there's something belittling by just mentioning the word toast in the conversation here, but that's where it is. But what Bloom's concern is basically, if I have a completely and wholly natural explanation for something, then I ought to go with that explanation, all things being equal. Why jump to the conclusion that this is a kind of intervention, is Bloom's point. Well, where do we get the idea anyway to make these connections? He's arguing, well, we're just hardwired. For whatever reason, he doesn't go much into the evolutionary aspects of why we might be hardwired, although we kind of touched on it a little bit up here. We're just hardwired to see intentionality, design, order, what was the other, certain kinds of patterns that seem to elicit purpose. And it may be because we're naturally curious creatures and we are unsatisfied in an existential sense with not knowing, with not having an explanation, with not having a justification of some sort. Why did this happen? Here's why. I can't explain this, but there are reasons. I don't know what they are, but they're there. And there's a kind of comfort, it takes us a little bit back to Marx, but there's a kind of comfort in having an explanation for something rather than we have no idea. I mean, you think about that. brother-in-law. I'm trying to think of what he is. Yeah, my sister's husband would be my brother-in-law. He has necrosis of the hip. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Neither had he. And he was happy when he finally learned what the hell it was. Now there's an explanation for this horrible, horrible pain, even though it meant hip replacement. There's some satisfaction psychologically of having an answer, right? And it may be the case that we're primed to come to these answers rather than being content, as we're going to see with Clifford, with being, with just saying, yeah, I don't know. Saying I don't know, feeling I don't know is perhaps uncomfortable. We stay on the toaster.
Yeah, still
Okay.
on the toast. Hey, would like a phenomenologist or something like that say that like the appearance of the toast is real because it's in our
Sure.
phenomenon?
Our experience, our
Yeah.
immediate experience, yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, so that's a tough one because the phenomenologist is trying to get a pre-theoretical analysis of experience
Yeah.
prior to thinking about it through the lens of a scientific hypothesis, a philosophical theory. It's just brute experience.
The
Let's
thing
try to
itself.
study consciousness. And this poses a problem for phenomenology as a study, as if it's even possible. Because already you've got a presumed brute fact. There's a face. Well, no, it's no more brute of a fact that there was a face there than that Britney Spears, which, by the way, I should erase that. What the hell are you guys doing in this class? That's what it says, that's what she's saying, right? It's not clear that that's a kind of brute fact, a given, independent of our cultural or biological expectations.
It's only a problem if you're like smuggling in a sort of like a platonic thing, like a true like there's the ideal reality of
Oh, I
that
see.
toast.
Yeah, this is
versus-
Bloom is no Platonist, so he would have no concern with this. He'd say, well, that's just an absurdity. Science has nothing to say about Platonic, otherworldly realms of archetypes of the perfect forms of things. That's not what science deals, so he wouldn't concern himself with that. He would dismiss it, I think, more so than try to answer it. Go ahead.
At the same time, I feel like what's real and what's not real is not really black and white
No.
because it also just depends on one's own subjective experience of reality.
This
and
would-
that
yeah,
may
yeah.
differ from what our concept of actual reality
Good.
is, but
Yeah.
to one's own experience and one's own perspective, it's still part of their own reality. So how do you kind of make that distinction between what is real and what's not when everything is so subjective?
So Clifford will talk to that. He would have us, he's a mathematician scientist, so he would probably go this quick route of, well, it isn't subjective. It's not the case that everything is subjective. After all, we have a scientific method, we have mathematical means of establishing the truth of certain claims. And we have to be cautious, Clifford would warn, of becoming overly open to saying it's all a matter of subjectivity and one can believe anything they want. Because after all, if it's all subjective, Clifford would reason, well then anything goes. And my inaugural speech was the biggest speech that anyone had ever listened to, period. Even if I'd never run for president. Tying in a few things there from previous election inauguration speech saying it was the largest. And it wasn't. But you don't get to have those, so that's not subjective. What you see here, though, that's a little different. When you get into religious ideas and religious experience, it's hard to look at it in an objective way. And when we get to James, we'll have to get, and Clifford in a moment, a little bit more grounding conceptually on what we mean by subjective versus objective, publicly available or something like that. So, how is it? Let's wrap this up. So, how Darwin ruins everything. He can explain, or evolutionary theory can be used to explain apparent design, apparent intentionality, and all of these recognition of patterns where there may not actually be any, without the appeal to a designer. And I'm not going to get into evolutionary theory, that's for a different class. and that's not my background, so I can't do it. But here's a video you can watch that gets at least a simulation of what natural selection is. And it's confusing, and the language, I think, is flawed. It needs to be changed. Natural selection implies what? A selector. That's not quite right. There isn't an intention, even in the language here, there's a kind of inbuilt intentionality, as if nature is selecting. That's a good one, that's a bad one. I want to take the giraffes with the longer necks because they're better. No, that's not how it works. Those moths are better because I like their color. No, those moths survive by accident. The accident of having a particular color exterior. What do they have? Skin? I don't know what's the color of a moth? Whatever. They're going to blend in if they are the same color of the surrounding trees, for example. Another set of moths that don't blend in, that stand out, let's say these are white oak trees or whatever, and the black moths are going to get eaten because they're easily seen by predators. And then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and all the soot from the industrial machines and everything else makes the trees a different color. They're darker now, and so now the lighter moths, which stood and survived easier before because they had a camouflage, natural camouflage of the trees behind them, now they're the ones that get picked out, and their genetic materials do not get spread, not because of anything they did wrong, but because they no longer have that niche, right? So natural selection or natural survival of certain genetic traits is dependent upon a lot of factors, none of which, according to Darwinian theory, none of which implies the need for an intentional designer or a fine tuner. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, that's just a really interesting example to bring up something like the Industrial Revolution, because in that context, that makes human beings the natural selector.
Well, not intentionally. It doesn't have to. You could think of it as any species doing anything. We just happen to be polluting our environment. And as what do economists call that? A negative externality.
Yeah.
The white moths get screwed. But we didn't say, let's build all this industry to ruin those moths.
It was never considered, yeah.
And so that's an externality that seems to be... accident may... even saying it's an accident implies, this is in contrast to when nature intends. That's the wrong language, too, for people like Blue. Now the question is, so that's what he means by accident. It's not intentional, it happens. It's a feature like the thing we discussed with moths. It's just so intuitively, it's so central to so many people. And to hear your faith is explained as an accident of nature is perhaps off-putting. And then you might respond, okay, I see what you're saying. There's an evolutionary explanation. There are natural explanations for where belief in the supernatural comes from. Does that make the supernatural explanations, the explanations that you find in revealed religions and traditions and so forth, does that make them null and void? According to people like Bloom, the answer is yes, because the conflicting hypotheses overrule the other. To some scientists, this is not the case. To some, like Stephen Jay Gould, religion and science have different areas of study. Non-overlapping magisteria. The text uses the word magisterial. I think that was just a typo. Non-overlapping magisteria. Magisteria, just area of teaching. What it is that they're encompassing. Religion deals with, as Stephen Jay Gould puts it, science deals with how the heavens go, and religion deals with how you go to heaven. It's something like that. It's clever. He thinks there is no conflict. They're non-overlapping. They don't deal with the same thing. Did you have a question, Alex?
Yeah. What terms do you like then, or what would you say instead of natural selection? Natural. Or what do you think might fit?
Yeah, it's survival of the fittest, natural selection, natural. What's the phrase? It preserves certain features. So they're preserved. Natural preservation, that doesn't sound quite right either. I don't really have a better one. Something better than selecting, because it does seem too intentional. Benjamin?
Yeah.
I think natural selection works fine.
Most scientists are fine with it. But yeah.
When you recognize like it's contested by like artificial selection, and also that
Uh-huh.
nature isn't necessarily like a force. It's just like, I guess you could call it like a term for the assembly of all the things that are interacting with each other, just like as a consequence of, whatever. That's not like
Yeah.
but like, however it came to be, it's just like an expression to say nature is what is here, and it's all the things that are happening, and it happens to each other. So it's not like a force selecting, it's like just what happens. It's like accident. Like it's basically accidental.
Yeah.
So saying that natural selection, it's like accidental selection.
Good. I don't want to jump too quickly ahead to the arguments for and against the existence of God, but there, of course, then is the question begged, there was an accident. That means it didn't happen on purpose. But where did the cars and the people in the cars come from to be in said accident? And then we just push that question back, which we're not going to get to now. All right, so maybe they shouldn't mix. And maybe we ought not even use science as a mechanism to try to study theology and religion. A lot of people push back and say, why are we even studying religion from a scientific perspective? For a number of reasons. Some do so out of fear that it will undermine their religious faith. In fact, this goes all the way back to Darwin. There was a famous case in which Darwin's theories are getting popularity and strength because of the power of its evidence. There was a woman who said, I can't remember, it was an interchange with Darwin himself. She was getting convinced by his hypotheses and said, I don't think any of this should be published, for fear that it would undermine people's faith. And it wasn't, I don't think this should be published because it's rubbish. It shouldn't be published because there are too good of arguments for it, and it will undermine people's faith. And once faith is gone, you change human nature. You change the trajectory of human history. And we'll come back to that point later. But the negative view of that is putting your head in the sand, not wanting to know things, right? And that's one interpretation of not wanting them to mix. On the other hand, you have people like Francis Collins, who are head of the Genome Project, thoroughly ensconced within science, but also recognizing that they're not incompatible, that they do ask overlapping questions. Science asks about the origin of the universe. So do theologians. Those overlap in a kind of Venn diagram. But they don't conflict. As Collins puts it, the God of the Bible is also the God of the genome, right? And so you see this within Catholic. He's a Catholic, I believe. You see this in Catholicism, in particular with the Jesuits, and in particular the Jesuits who run a what's it called? You look into the skies. Observatory in Italy. It's completely run and had been started by the Jesuits many decades ago, centuries ago, in fact, and show that science and religion and theology do not conflict, even though they cover some of the same questions. Here's the book by Francis Collins in which he addresses that at length, the consilience of the two. But then you got Richard Dawkins, who is very clear. He says, a cowardly flabbiness of the intellect afflicts otherwise rational people when it comes to confronting the faults of religion. Although, he says, significantly not in the face of younger traditions, such as Scientology or the Moonies. In other words, we have no problem calling out the absurdities, he says, of people who are Scientologists. But his argument is, and I'm not going to make the case here, that belief in historical Christianity is no different, ultimately, than belief in Scientology. It's just that Scientology is newer. Cowardly flabbiness is a way with words, does Dawkins. So there he thinks the two overlap. If I'm going to believe in a God, and a God that intervenes in the world, that's something now that science can study. Is there a situation in which your claim is that a divine presence has caused something to happen in the world? Now, if it's something that's happening in the world, it's the subject matter of science, even though you're invoking God. For those of you who remember your math, the student gives, it's pretty clever. If you don't know the answer, Jesus is always the answer. The teacher here is not having any of it. Here they're non-overlapping magisteria. They should have put that. That would have been more clever. No. These are non-overlapping magisteria. This leaves us with some questions before we move on to Clifford, which we need to do quickly. If there is a conflict between science and religion, how do we decide what to believe and why? So what if there's a conflict, you might say? Studying the claims of religion and theology with the tools of science is like studying poetry through mathematics. For example, there's better analogies than that. But you know what I'm saying? You take a class in poetry and all of a sudden your math teacher says, all right, pull out your protractors. We're going to evaluate this poem. What? It's the wrong tool, isn't it? What the hell are you doing? Yeah.
My favorite philosopher right now says that atheism is more religious than Christianity because of the such a strong belief in.
Is that Jordan Peterson? No.
He, not a philosopher, Jordan Peterson.
Slavoj Zizek.
Ah, yeah.
He says that scientists are more religious than, or atheists are more religious than Christians.
They take more on faith.
They have such a strong belief in science, whereas a lot of Christians are sort of on the agnostic side or a little.
Yeah. To jump to James,
I think that's interesting.
what Zizek, that's Slavoj, I don't know how to spell it.
Yeah, that's right.
Zizek. And there's a movie.
CK.
Is it CK?
Yeah.
Really? That doesn't seem right. Anyway, there's a movie about him with the apostrophe at the end because I don't know why. Making the case that he's talking about this though, if he's going to be honest, and hopefully he will be. Scientism is not the same thing as science. Scientism is an overemphasis in the capacity of the scientific method, of the empirical method. It is putting all our eggs in one basket. Not only can we describe evolution through science, not only can we explain the origin of the universe through science, not only can we explain human mentality through science, we can explain love. We can explain justice. We can explain moral truths. We can explain questions of meaning and purpose and function. All of that through science. That is a term that James, we'll see next week, or next class, William James would call scientism. And I think that's what Zizek's talking about. To have trust in science is a positive, I think Bloom would say. To sacralize it is to engage in scientism. To think that science can answer all of our questions. The moment you ask the question, what's the value of science? Guess what you've done? You've left the realm of science and you're in the domain of philosophy. Or in whatever discipline that's dealing in value claims. But this question then gets, we should ask Zizek, wait a minute, if science is just another religion, then it ought to be taught in theology courses. There's what's known in logic as a reductio ad absurdum. If what you're saying is true, here's an absurd conclusion that even you wouldn't accept. Therefore, what you said first is probably not true. Reductio ad absurdum, or to reduce to absurdity. I'll talk more about that question with James, though. That is an interesting point. And there we might want to get into a difference between faith and trust. You ask a scientist, do they have trust? Do they trust the scientific method? Do they trust the peer review system of inquiry in science? Most of them would say yes. Do you have faith in it? They might push back and say, no, faith is not something that's applicable to science. And there you get into some divisions, though, and disagreements. All right, questions on Bloom. You're going to be looking at your toast now, more detail, every morning? We spent too much time on the toast. All right, then. What I want to do now is have you break into groups of 2 or 3, maybe 4 at most, just those nearest you. We roughly rows, so it's easy just to turn that way. Some of you haven't met before, introduce yourselves and briefly discuss your answers to the question that you asked. Maybe you answered the same thing. If you didn't do the questions online yet, make sure you get those in going forward. Briefly introduce yourselves and discuss your answers. Normally I might give a little more time going forward where I want to make sure we have enough covered today to move on to the next one, next class, get into James. Just a reminder, when I post things, I think you get a notification. This is suggested readings on occasion. I might add material to buttress some of the readings. Some of the readings are relatively short, really short in some cases, and I find it not unacceptable to have you do more reading. For whatever reason you don't have the time to do it, that's okay because it's suggested. But this is the full text. It gives you, I think maybe starting after page 9 or so, it gets more into what he considers to be sufficient reasons to believe something, which is, of course, necessary. I think the text cut that too short. So I'm not going to do that all the time, but I'll occasionally have links to materials related to the readings for this class. All right, so just a quick reminder, cell phones need to be turned off, put in the off position, or completely destroyed, whichever you prefer, as long as they're nowhere visible. Okay, so also what I would do normally is get right into a discussion that you might have with respect to your reflections on those discussion questions. And again, get those in on time. They're relatively easy points. I'm looking for you to give your viewpoint on it and explain it. Couple paragraphs should be sufficient to answer, and you get to pick the question. There's usually 3 or 4 questions after each reading. Which question are you most interested in answering? Which question most clearly connects with you? Give reasons for why you think the way that you do. That's where points will most likely come off, is where you don't explain the thing you just said. Rather than just saying, I think Clifford means this, and I think this is how I would react, or whatever the question may be, without telling me why. A couple sentences at least explain why you think the way that you do. You get that in on time, you're more than likely to get up to the 5 points. Then you show up in class to briefly discuss that. That's the other 5 points. It describes all that in the guideline for the assignment. Okay, so Clifford. I overheard some of you, I was eavesdropping, fairly extreme view does Clifford have with respect to belief. And a very interesting, maybe unique one, or maybe it appealed to you. This idea, the title is called Ethics of Belief. This is the general title of what I want to get into now, the relationship between faith and reason. But his paper is called The Ethics of Belief. It's not the ethics of whatever action you're doing, it's the ethics of believing. It's therefore presumed in the title that one can be unethical based just upon maintaining or assenting to a particular belief. This is a very strong claim. What are beliefs, after all? Here are some opening questions. These slides are available to you. You don't need to write down again what's on the slides. Simply take note of what I'm saying about the slides. So here's some questions I want us to consider. We won't be able to answer all these. We can go into some of these in more or less depth as you wish. Are all beliefs the same kind of mental state? Is one belief no different than any other kind of belief? What do I mean by that? So I believe puppies exist. I have that belief. I suspect you do too. Is that same as I believe there are 2 puppies here? I don't actually believe that. I should probably make that clear. I don't believe there are 2 puppies here. What kind of belief are A and B? And are they different than the belief I have in 1 + 1 = 2? And D, I believe poking puppies in the eyes is unjust. Is that a different kind of belief than the first 3?
Yes.
Seems like it. Hopefully. Or maybe not. Maybe not. I believe a triangle is a 3-sided figure with interior angles equal 180 degrees. I couldn't add puppies to that one. I don't know what to say about. And puppies love triangles. I believe I can fly. I should have sung that for you. What is the difference between each of these? And what sort of belief might religious belief be? If it's even describable by any of those kinds of beliefs. You can vary this. I believe puppies exist is a different kind. That might be an existential, not in the Jean-Paul Sartre sense of existentialism, but existence claim. Is it the puppies being poked? Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry. Most people find it abhorrent that you would even think of poking puppies in the eyes. I'm not assuming that your laughter implies you are okay with pupping. Anyway, empirical, mathematical. Empirical had to do with, these two oftentimes go together. We'll see whether or not that's the case when we look at arguments for the existence of God. But how are these different and how are they similar? Where is their overlap? What kind of belief? Religious beliefs in general. Where would it rest? Is it not like any of those? Yeah.
I mean, you would say, or Clifford would say that it belongs with D because religion is dealing with the world of values, and values goes with ethics and morals.
Yeah,
and
sure.
we find poking puppies in the eyes to be unjust because we understand empathy and
Okay.
it depends. I mean, you could argue they have souls or not or whatever, but just
But isn't that question, whether they have souls or not, more like this?
whether souls
And
exist.
God exists. Wouldn't it be more like this? Or is my belief in God a purely ethical belief? Do you know what I mean? Because that's how you were saying the religious beliefs are akin to moral beliefs, and therefore they're mostly like this one. But what if I make a claim that a God exists or that I have a soul? That doesn't seem as obvious as that. And it may be definitional. Human beings have souls, and there are non-physical. There you get a definition. But you're still back to the question of how do we know such things exist? And so most theologians might say, wait a minute, it's not just a moral claim. I'm making an existential claim. I'm saying there is a God, and here are the features of this God, and that God exists. And bless you. Yes, gods and puppies are not the same type of entity, but I'm speaking of both of them as existing. Remember the facts like sand or fantasy like Santa? Right? Those are different kinds of modes of existence. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of said what I was going to say. It's hard to pin it down into one of those categories. You could say conceptual, existential, moral, logical would probably be harder to say that it is, but you could, I guess, say it's logical in the sense that if it's beneficial to you to believe in something, like if that provides you with some sort of comfort, then it would be logical to go for something that provides you with comfort.
Interesting. Very good. That will get us to James next class. That question of whether it's useful to you. I don't know that he would use the word logical. He would use the word pragmatic. And it isn't always the case that which is pragmatic is logical. When I put those together, I'm thinking of logical claims such as the law of non-contradiction, which says you can't have A and not A at the same time. Or modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q, that's a logical deduction. Get that out of your way so you can see that. That's a logical deduction. And so it seems true by definition. It's a logical inference you can make. If P is true, then Q is true. I assert that P is true. It follows that that is a deductively valid inference. That's what we mean by logical. And I have the belief that that is a valid form, for example.
Okay, so pragmatic then, just something that's practical for you, I guess.
Yeah, and it may be, it would be weird for you to say, and this will jump to James' next class, I believe in puppies. And somebody asked me, but why? And he says, well, because of the cash payout and believing in such things. It benefits me to believe that puppies exist. I have a fuller life in believing in their existence. And notice that's another distinction. Do you believe God exists? Seems like a different kind of question than do you believe in God? You see, again, there's a difference in belief, right? If I'm confident that my son's going to do well in the soccer game, I say, Milo, I believe in you. And then if he's being especially snarky, he'd say, oh, really? You think I exist? That's funny, because there's two senses of I'm equivocating on belief. To believe in someone is to have trust that they'll do well. I have faith in you. Doesn't mean I think you exist. It means I think you'll do well, and so forth. And then we'll get into that debate of trust and faith again later. But I think these opening questions are going to be important to get us at where we want to go with the Clifford and James reading, which are meant to be read as a couplet. James's paper is a response to Clifford's, as we'll see. So consider any random belief you happen to have, and I chose that narwhals exist. There was a time in which I didn't have the belief about narwhals because I didn't know there were such things. And then I was told of a narwhal, and I saw a picture of one, and I thought, that's a mythical creature. And then I talked to somebody who's in marine biology, and they assured me, no, that's a real thing. There really are narwhals, unicorns of the sea. Anna, you had a question?
Yeah. With that, doesn't there have to be some sort of absolute truth? Wouldn't it be more like moral relativism if I'm saying that something something is true for me but not for you? Wouldn't it have to be maybe all-encompassing? Like if someone claims, like, I believe in God, and that's true for them, then like where does that absolute belief come in, or anything else?
Okay.
I believe
Yeah.
in puppies for me.
Oh, well,
but
there,
not.
yes. Very few people would be confident and comfortable saying, I believe in puppies. I believe they exist. You may not believe they exist, but I do. I think there you find a different kind of belief than I believe in God. I believe in justice. I believe in the kindness of other people. After all, do we have evidence do you have evidence that the next person you meet on the street is going to be a nice person? I don't know that you do. You might have counter evidence to that fact, and in fact think, oh, everyone's a bunch of jackasses. And then you go into the world with the attitude, everyone's a jackass. Guess how you interact with other people? Yes, and then they become jackasses. This is something that Clifford, I don't think, thinks much about. We'll come back. I'm trying to jump ahead here a little bit. But part of what I want us to consider, again in the background, where did the belief in narwhals come from? How was it justified by you? I don't remember. I said a marine biologist. I don't know if that's even accurate. It was somebody who studied the oceans. I don't remember who it was. I don't remember where it was or when. But I now have the belief that narwhals exist, and that pointy thing is a tooth. It's, I think, used to get out of ice. When there's ice on the top of the surface, they can smash through it. I think that's the explanation. It's a better explanation than that it's a weapon to spear their prey, because then imagine you spear a fish on that. What the hell are they going to do with it? It's like, you get a carcass on their tooth and nothing they can do with it. It's really a weird creature, the narwhal. I hope you all find that to be the case as well. Anyway, where do any of your beliefs come from? Do you remember? That's significant. Do you have justification of the sort that Clifford's looking for any of your beliefs? Well, how do we get our beliefs? One approach is what's sometimes called strong rationalism. That's what Clifford's advocating. And very briefly, that is that our beliefs need to be coherent. That is, they need to fit consistently together. If I believe this, if I believe A, then I must deny that not A is true. If I believe narwhals exist, I can't also have the belief that narwhals are mythical creatures. They have to be coherent and fit together. But they also have to correspond. My beliefs and my web of beliefs has to correspond to what is external to me. How do I know that? How can I get to that? How can I offer support for such beliefs? Well, the evidence has to be of a certain sort. It has to be publicly available to all rational people. Way too much to get into this. This is a whole discipline in philosophy known as epistemology. Who remembers what epistemology is? Study of knowledge. The difference between belief and opinion. How can we justify our claims to say that they're true? There's a whole discipline devoted to this. What does it mean for something to be publicly available and to all rational people? Who and why is one being irrational for maintaining a particular belief when there wasn't sufficient counter evidence in front of them? There are exceptions, of course, to this. There may be publicly available evidence, but in my particular situation, for example, I may not have access to that evidence. And therefore, my failure to believe something may be justifiable and not irrational. So even Clifford would allow for example, let's say I'm 8 years old and my sister Gretchen and all my friends have told me Santa exists. My parents have lied to me over the years that Santa exists. And my school teachers continually lie to me that Santa exists. My local meteorologist tells me that Santa was found flying over blah, blah, blah. And so I believe up to the unhealthy age of 8, maybe it was 10, doesn't matter really. I'm not talking about me after all anyway. Is it irrational for me to believe that Santa exists? Not in that case. If I, as a child, everyone around me, everyone I trust has lied to me, and I don't have access to external sources of information that might give me a competing hypothesis, it's perfectly rational and it's understandable why I, as that 15-year-old, would still believe Santa. Change the age there, you see. However, if there are alternatives that are publicly available and they're there for me, there's evidence. Here's the data, and it's publicly available, presented to you by experts in the field. For example, let's imagine I'm someone who believes that the MMR shot causes autism spectrum, and I continue to fervently believe it and push that view to the point where I get a lot of other people to agree with me. And then there's a measles outbreak in Northern California. There is significant and publicly available data about the causal interactions between the MMR shot and autism spectrum. And there is no causal connection, according to experts. I mean, that's a politically, socially, ethically controversial issue, and in California in particular, as it turns out. But what scientists mean, what Clifford means by publicly available, is that if you wanted to, you could find it out for yourself. Whereas if we're talking about, for instance, a private, individual experience, I can't offer you publicly available evidence to replicate something that I personally experienced and then derive a conclusion from. We'll talk more about that with religious experiences. Another approach is fideism. I'm going to talk about that with Pascal and with Kierkegaard. That's that famous phrase that St. Paul gives us, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Does anyone get that reference?
Yeah, it's kind of, Athens is a place that is really symbolic of philosophy and reason, and you have a place like Jerusalem where the Hebrew people are from, and that's a deeply religious. It's reason and faith, and
they don't
Christianity is arguably tries to be a blend of that in the early stage.
In fact, still today, if one looked at the history of philosophy up until, I was looking for a specific date, let's just say around the 1900s, the history of philosophy and Western tradition is almost entirely trying to meld Christian, Judaic, Islamic theology with Greek primarily, logic, and rational philosophy, trying to get them to fit together. That changes around the 20th century when you have much more secular philosophy, but for the most part, the history of Western philosophy is in effect trying to intertwine Athens and Jerusalem. That's largely what it is. But according to fideists, faith alone, Kierkegaard we'll talk about later, and definitely Pascal next week, reason's incompatible with faith, and faith requires free will. This is a strong view, and it's an interesting one. I can't get into the arguments here, but just note that one of the arguments, at least from Kierkegaard, is that if we have arguments to justify our belief in the supernatural, arguments like this that we can plug in and a conclusion that necessarily follows, we are not free to accept the conclusion. We are compelled out of rationality to accept it. It's not like I can say, if P then Q, P, therefore, I choose to believe Q. It's Q has to be true. It's a contradiction to deny it. I am not free. That is a fundamental problem. If one argues for the existence of God and then comes to the conclusion there is or there isn't a God, because the logic is to compel you, it's not a movement of free choice, whereas faith is. We'll have to say a lot more about that later.
So would they believe in miracles?
Who? Fideists?
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Because it would give you a choice to believe.
That's a very good question. And that's a problem for the fideists. That's a problem for those who advocate for petitionary prayer, which is to say, God, change this element of the world for me now or soon. Or for those who believe in a God that's all good, all-knowing, all-powerful. Because if such a God intervenes in such a way that it's unmistakable that it was God, then I have no free will other than to accept. I'll talk about this with St. Paul. Speaking of St. Paul, he was, of course, called Saul before he converted or was forced to convert. His road to Damascus, right? Jesus came down and said, "You better not call Saul." There's a show called "You Better Call Saul" from spin-off of Breaking Bad. It's excellent. Actually, you should see it. I only reference that because of the name. Anyway, Saul converts, had a religious experience. The question is, was it a miraculous experience which God intervenes and makes it the case that he should convert? After all, Saul, at least from the scriptures, wasn't confused. It's not like, how should I interpret this? It was Jesus talking directly to me, asking why I'm harming him through harming his people. It's not a matter of, can I choose to believe that? It's, this is a table right in front of me. I don't choose to believe it. It's, I confronted with it, I can't but believe it. And there you have a problem. And that's why fideism is such an interesting approach. Do you want to add to it?
I don't know. This is really to kind of put this slide in. We touched upon it kind of recently, but I was just thinking about like the faith that science has, and I wanted to know a little bit about where it's at right now, because like if you go all the way back and you say like, okay, scientists have faith that science can explain everything, right? I mean, if you're talking about scientism, scientism believes that.
This is almost always a negative connotation. There are a few who say, yeah, I'm going to take that on positively. But
right,
in most cases, it's negative.
The essence of science is kind of, that's their goal, because they believe that. Well,
for scientismists, I don't know how to, for someone who's engaged, who says that, they're into scientism.
Okay.
People like Stephen Jay Gould, people like Richard Dawkins recognizes science doesn't deal with moral questions. They may give us facts. What we do with those facts, how we should approach those facts, Dawkins tells us, well, moral philosophy may be the road there. And so those who argue, nope, it's science, Sam Harris is one who seems to push this view, science can give us our moral sense. And there you find that there's debates about that. And he's accused of being engaged in scientism in that respect. And he wouldn't like the idea of using again, back to earlier distinction, faith in science. We have trust based upon experience. And so we make inductive inferences. This study gave us this information in the past. We can replicate this study and make predictions about the future. We don't have faith that Halley's Comet will come at this time. We trust based upon the mathematics, based upon experiments, based upon experience, and so forth. To say we have faith, at least people like Dawkins and Gould and others would say, is to not engage in science anymore at all. That's a different mental state. And I think Kierkegaard would agree. Pascal, I'm not sure about. We'll see why when we get to Pascal. And then finally, critical rationalism. Again, I have Pascal here because I'm not sure where to put him. Here's where we'll see William James. Critical rationalism. I don't know if that's helpful, that phrase. Faith is not sufficient in many, many cases. Faith is to be reserved for particular situations. And when there's a conflict, we ought to be able to address both of them. Come at it from both angles. Ignore those people enjoying their lives, leaving class early, not getting their money's worth. We're going to stay the whole time. Yeah? You all paid for this. Who wants to stay later anyway? One?
It's kind of a short class for what we're talking about.
It is. That's true. That's true. We have 5 more minutes. We'll be able to wrap it up. But once we accept this, now we have the question of how they then interact and what tools do we use to evaluate each of them. See it.
So, did strong rationalism, does Clifford just reject faith entirely?
Yes. He does not find belief. In fact, he's very categorical. It is wrong always for anyone to believe anything. And I think that's it. Upon insufficient evidence. There's more, it's wrong always for anyone to believe anything. Anything upon insufficient evidence. That's a broad claim. In fact, there he is. There's actually, where is it? It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Not like you're mistaken practically, you shouldn't believe that. It's you are morally flawed for holding that belief. And that's what he looks like. Yes?
I was just gonna say, does he find like every single religious person to be unethical? Because they're not like paying attention to science?
Not just they're not paying attention to science, because
Well, the
he
evidence
broadens,
environment,
yeah, he broadens the concept of evidence. He doesn't say that in the reading. He doesn't say that even in the full text that I offered you online. He doesn't say that anywhere. It's implied, though.
So he considers like majority of the world to be unethical. Cool.
It seems like the fact that he doesn't say that is interesting, but it seems to be implied. Unless he's open. No, I believe in this faith because here are the reasons, or something like that. And because after all, many people who believe in God or gods or what have you do find they have justification, from St. Anselm to Aquinas to Augustine to other philosophers whose last names start with an A. Lots of them in the Western tradition say, in fact, they're compatible and reason can buttress our faith. So I think Clifford would at least find them to be more respectable and would disagree with their conclusions, maybe, just to give him a little bit, to be charitable to him. As charitable as one can be with somebody who has a beard like that. How does one have dinner when the beard is like that? Yours is fine. I mean, that's going all the way. He's got like lunch from weeks ago in there. That was common to have. Anyway, here's the crux of the paper. Right? The danger to society. Here's the ethics part of it. To believe with insufficient evidence. Anything. The danger to society is not merely that it should ever believe wrong things, though that is great enough, but that it should become credulous, that is, naive, and lose the habit of testing things and inquiring into them, for then it must sink back into savagery. Maybe a little hyperbole here. It may matter little to me in my cloud castle of sweet illusions and darling lies, but it matters much to humanity, that's what he means by that I have made my neighbors ready to deceive. The credulous man is the father to the liar and to the cheat. In other words, if we habituate ourselves to believe things with insufficient evidence, we risk undermining the entire cultural, scientific, technological, advanced societies that we are. And we fall back into creatures who are naive enough to accept foolishness and possibly leads to our downfall. It is wrong. We have a duty toward humanity to justify our beliefs. You're right, the class time's too short. We'll have to stop. I did have to wrap up where I was last time. The good thing is the James reading ties in very nicely with this. In fact, James is responding specifically to Clifford. So make sure you've read that. We will have I intend to do some group work. Quizzes are usually going to be, I intend them to be in class. If they're not, if we run out of time, then they'll be done individually online where you can submit the material. I'll let you know next class what we'll do given our time. All right, I will see you on Thursday. Oh yeah, if you came in late, I think I got everyone though who came in late. Let's see. I think I got you already. Come on. Where is Clarissa? Yes. Oh, I already got. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah.
Yep, I got you.
Cool.
Elijah's here. Eli's here. Who else came in late? Did nope, that's everyone.
I'm with that guy.
It's all my cake. So I won't critique it.
There's just some of this in the. No, okay. Sorry, I'm sorry for
No,
that.
she usually checks.
That's
What?
good. That there's nothing left in the.
Oh, I do. I make sure.
Yeah, you got to.
Hey, he's not going to do
saver.
it.
Very nice, thank you. Very kind of
Let
you.
me know what you think about it later. And
I all right. Oh, I forgot to rock out to this one more. Oh, it's so good. I'm sorry to bring that. Clearly this is affecting you in a horrible way. I'm sorry I let that go.
Have you seen The Pervert's Guide to Ideology?
To what?
Pervert's Guide to Ideology?
No.
Okay. You should
The
watch
Pervert's
it.
Guide
That's
to Ideology?
Zach's movie.
Oh, no, I haven't. Okay.
You'll like it.
Wait, is that movie?
Yeah.
But that's the subtitle of it or something?
Well, that's the title. Maybe he has multiple movies. I think he has multiple movies.
Oh, yeah. So he's your favorite, huh?
Yeah, I like him a lot. He talks about ideology a lot.
Yeah.
Says the title.
I had an opportunity to see him in Chicago with my philosophy club, and I don't recall why, I missed it. I couldn't go.
Pretty incredible.
They all said it was amazing.
Yeah.
He had a debate with, he mentioned Jordan Peterson, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
He debated him, and apparently that debate was a bit of a dud. They
Yeah,
ended up agreeing on some
I
of
thought
the
it was interesting, but okay. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, have a good one.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Hibiki, and so I have one question about this class.
The philosophy of religion?
Yes. So is this possible to register this class yet?
You will be quite behind,
Uh-huh.
but there's space, so if you don't mind being behind, I don't have any more syllabi, but once you add the class, you can find it online.
But I need to get code for.
Right. So, use this code, so print your name, use that code, and then once you add, you can log on to Canvas, and you can see the syllabus, and try to catch up